Just a few words this morning. As the kids have shared with us, Jesus came to this earth. And that was not the beginning. That Jesus, being God, was and is to come. And yet, He came in the form of a baby. As you think about the history of God working with mankind, and we could start in the beginning in the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. But from that point on, and even some promise that was made, even when the sin had happened, and God was making promises that through the woman's seed there would be deliverance, that Satan would be overcome in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. But through then the history, as God dealt with mankind, He continued to bring champions. Champions that would deliver the people. One of those champions that comes to mind, I mean, when I say champion, who do you think of? David. That's exactly who I thought of. When you think of God's champion, here was David, a young boy, standing out there when the rest of the armies of Israel were retreating, when they were shrinking back because Goliath, this mighty man of the Philistines, was coming out and he was taunting the people of God. He was taunting the soldiers that were there that were supposed to be defending the people of God. And yet they were shrinking back and David stood firm. And so we think of those instances and the champions that God would use, and in some cases the unlikely, Gideon, who clung to God or said to God when God approached him, and God called him a mighty warrior. I mean, it says the angel of the Lord came and he was threshing the wheat inside the winepress because he was hiding when he was doing it because he didn't want the Philistines to take it away. And so he was hiding in there doing it, and God calls him a mighty warrior, and he says, I'm the mighty warrior. I am least in my family, and my family is least in the tribe, and our tribe is the least in Israel. How could I be a warrior? And yet he was the one that God was going to use. Undeniably, for all the things that he has Gideon do, undeniably God was using him to deliver Israel. Why Israel? Because Israel became the chosen people of God because of the faith of Abraham. Because Abraham believed God and it reckoned to him his righteousness, that God had promised him that he would have descendants like the sand on the seashore. But he also promised him that through his seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And find from that time on, that promise, the same that he promised that the seed of the woman would bruise the head of the serpent. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, he makes the same seed promise to Abraham. That in your seed all nations of the earth will be blessed. All families of the earth, chapter 12 of Genesis. And so we see God pronouncing a blessing that is going to come to all people. He preserves a nation, those that come from Abraham. And he uses champions to preserve them, such as Gideon and David. And we just keep naming off those that he uses in order to deliver the people of Israel, to preserve them to the point that Jesus is going to be born. And he is the champion, not just physically producing or protecting a nation of people that is a physical nation, but this time a champion spiritually. In the world's eyes, you wouldn't see a champion going to the cross. It shows us right away, from our standpoint, looking back, that Jesus was a different kind of champion. Why did he have to do that? I mean, why not be able to come to the earth just simply as a king? That he would come and he would rule people. I mean, there had been other child kings. We think of Josiah, who took the throne at 8 years old, and he was a good king. Out of all these lists of bad kings that Israel had, Josiah was a good king. Probably because he was a young boy at the time. His conscience probably hadn't been seared like some of the rest of them at that point. But Jesus didn't come that way. He wasn't sitting on that kind of a throne. Why did he have to be born a baby? Why did he have to, even in his own words, the foxes have holes for dens, and the Son of Man has no place to lay his head? In Hebrews chapter 2, beginning verse 14, it says this: since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death. Since we have flesh and blood, he too shared in our humanity, so that by his death he could destroy the one who holds the power of death. You reflect back to the Garden of Eden, of Satan saying in that context, no, you won't die. If you eat of that, you won't die. You'll just become wise like God. And from that point on, he held the power of death over mankind. Death that was a separation from God. Death that did happen that day, as God had said, in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. Physically, they did live on, but they were taken away from the tree of life, taken away from its presence. They died physically too, because that no longer supplied to them. But spiritually, they died. They had a separation from God. And Satan held that power. But since we have flesh and blood, he too shared in humanity, so that by death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason he has been made like his brothers every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God. For this reason, it says, he had to be made like his brothers in every way. He had to be like us, so that he could become a merciful and faithful high priest for us. A high priest is one who goes in between for somebody else, go before God. He is our high priest. He is the one that can approach God, but he can do it mercifully now. He can do it faithfully now because he remained faithful. But he understands there is mercy. It says, because, verse 18, he himself suffered when he was tempted. He is able to help those who are being tempted. What is it you suffer when you're tempted? If you're being tempted in whatever way, there are things that might tempt you that wouldn't tempt somebody else. Or there are things that tempt other people that might not tempt you at all. I am not tempted at all to pick this stand up and throw as far as I can back to the back of the auditorium. I have no temptation to do that at all. Maybe a little bit. I'm not suffering because I'm not doing that. You suffer when you're being tempted. Temptation, according to James, is when you're carried away and enticed by intense desire. And when that gives way, the temptation turns into sin. if you're really wanting to do something, you know it's not right. If you're really wanting to say something, you know it's not right. If you're really wanting just to think in your mind and dwell on something that you know it's not right for you to dwell on. And you resist it. Do you suffer? Yeah. It might be that you could do something and you got a situation in which you're going to suffer. And you don't give in to that temptation. I mean, how quickly could Jesus have called legions of angels to deliver him from the cross? And yet he didn't. And so for some time, so little of reasons that we think, okay, we're going to go through this. If I just say this, or if I just do this, I can get out of it. You guys are making all the applications yourselves right now, and you know the situation I'm talking about. Oh, it's just this moment, and just for a little bit, I can not have to hear this. I won't have to own up to it. Nobody will know that I'm guilty. Whatever applies to you. So how did Jesus suffer? He's not just talking about the cross. He's not just talking about the scourging. Jesus suffered in what he was tempted. Listen to this, chapter 4. Chapter 4, he says it this way in verse 15, and still in Hebrews, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet without sin. Tempted in every way just as we are, yet without sin. That's the reason, he says in chapter 2, that he suffered in what he was tempted. Because we understand the suffering when we're tempted and we have to resist that temptation. Because sometimes it creates a suffering or we're trying to avoid a suffering. That's the reason the temptation is there. Other times it may just be simply that we're struggling so much with doing what is right. Or maybe not doing what is wrong. Do we suffer? So verse 18 of chapter 2, because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. That's why he came. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, reflecting on what we read in chapter 2. In verse 50, he says, I declare to you, brothers, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Nor does perishable inherit the imperishable. Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. As much as Jesus took flesh and blood, came to this earth, he's saying we will be changed. Because flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. It's something spiritual. He says in verse 54, when the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true, death has been swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory. Death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, He gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. If He had not become flesh and blood, He could not do that. The price had to be paid. The death had to happen. The separation. We're in the Father. As Jesus states on the cross, why have you forsaken me? If you feel that. You guys want to come up? If you feel that you look at your life and anything in it, and you say, how can God have anything to do with me? Surely God would turn His back on me. He did, but it wasn't on you, it was on Him. Because He did that part for you. So the goal then for us is this. In chapter 12 of Hebrews, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set for Him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. He saw it to completion. He came. He went through this. He understands. And He finished it. That's why He came. That's why He wants you to come to Him too. If you need to come as we stand.